Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. I like to cover a variety of topics on this show. I'm especially interested in the Enlightenment and what came out of it. So, the French Revolution seemed to be an obvious topic for me. So, we have a great guest here today to talk to us about the French Revolution and what led up to it. He's a professor of history at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He's authored numerous books, including The Transition to Capitalism in Modern France and State and Society in 18th Century France. Professor Stephen J. Miller, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I almost forgot your name there for a second. I've got so many professors swimming around in my head. I almost got you wrong. All right. So I guess a good place to start would be the last quarter of the 18th century. What was life like in France, both politically, culturally, religiously?
Well, I tend to think socially, right? That's what I study most and what I know. And the majority of French in 1789 were peasants. And when I say peasant, I mean people who lived in the countryside, in communities, in rural areas, and farmed to feed themselves. And their whole life was based around the peasant commune. If one goes to rural France today, it's completely different from rural America, because in France, one sees these tight villages where the housing is right against houses are right against packed against one another, and then the fields are around them, and that's the place in which the great majority, over 80% of the French, lived. And the peasants, they were subjected to taxation, to to maintain the whole edifice of the absolute estate of the kings and the court in Versailles, the whole administration of the country, the military. They were the basic taxpayers for that. And they were also subjected to seigneurial dues. The dominant class of the monarchy were noble lords or seigneurs who owned the most land, though the peasants, they owned land, subsistence plots. The nobles owned more land, but also, in addition to their land ownership, they had rights over the peasants. They had the right to collect dues from peasants. They had a monopoly over grain mills, which were absolutely important because people grew grain and milled it to make bread. And they had a monopoly over the grain mills, over ovens needed to make bread. Every time there's a property transaction, they got to collect a fee simply because they were noble lords. The peasants had to pay taxes, as I mentioned. The nobles, the lordly class, were exempt. They were tax exempt for the reason that, going back to ancient feudal history, they were supposed to be the ones that fought for society. They were the warrior class, the knights. So they were exempt from taxation. They were privileged. Um, Politically, it was an absolutist regime. The absolute sovereign power, the only one with the right to make laws, was the king in Versailles, Louis XVI. But his will, the policies he formulated, he formulated them with nobles, his advisors in Versailles. It was the tradition was to pick the heads of the administrative families who had dynasties of administrators in the families to formulate policy in Versailles, and the highest nobles, dukes and barons and marquises in Versailles. Probably 2,000 people normally went in and out of the palace, and some were allowed into sanctum of policy making. Some because their family members knew the Queen, Marie Antoinette, and she put in a good word for them, and so they got to sit in the councils and have to make policy. But once policy was made, it went through a whole hierarchy of officials who were, until the lowest ranks in the countryside and in the towns, were nobles. So to enforce policy, the king had to have the judges approve it and be willing to enforce it. And the highest judges were all nobles. To finance the regime, the king had to go through financiers, the heads of the dynasties of which were also from high noble families. So it was an absolutist state, in the sense that the king was the sovereign power, the only one with the rights to make laws, and all of it flowed through the noble class down to the majority population of peasants and artisans.
And what role did the clergy play?
Clergy were also tax exempt because they were the ones who handled the spiritual needs of the French. And there were about, the French population was about more or less 28 million in 1789. It had been 20 million in about 1700, 28 million by 1789. The nobles made up maybe 200,000, 400,000 with their families. The clergy, maybe 170,000 people. The rest, mostly peasants, but some townspeople and artisans. And the clergy, they were tax exempt because they handled the spiritual needs of the entire community. They were funded because they were also landowners. The clergy owned 5 to 10% of the land, and usually they had the best land, including a lot of the best urban property, which was valuable. And they also had the right to collect tithes. Peasants not only had to pay taxes and seigneurial dues, and they often had to rent land from nobles and other large landowners, but they also had to pay tithes to the clergy, which could amount to anywhere from 10 to 20% of harvests. And that is how the church funded itself, with its land holdings and the tithes. But the church was unequal. At the very top, there were bishops, there were 150 of them, each at the head of a diocese. And within each diocese, there were maybe 200 priests. And those priests, known as curés, came into contact with the peasants in the villages on a daily basis. But the towns had cathedrals, and the heads of those cathedrals were bishops who had the lower clergy under their supervision. Right? And so it was, and the top ranks of the clergy, they came from noble families, those bishops, and whereas most of the curés, the priests in the villages, they came from merchant families or wealthier peasant families, maybe 1 or 2% of them from noble families.
Right. In my view, history is largely shaped by philosophy. This is a very philosophically rich period in history. We're in the Enlightenment. France is absolutely loaded with philosophers and economists, and I won't be able to go through all of them with you, but I would like to go through some of the main ones. So I'm going to go over maybe 3 or 4, and I'll name them, and you just tell me a little bit about them. So I want to start with Montesquieu.
Montesquieu, he understood probably the monarchy and how the French absolutism worked better than any of the philosophes, any of the philosophers of 18th century France. In his most famous book is The Spirit of the Laws. He divides governments into 3 types: despotism, and where the ruler has no institutional checks on his authority; monarchy, which he stated had intermediary powers, basically the nobility, which restrained royal authority and protected the people. And then he stated that there was republican government, the 3rd type, which was from the people. But he captured monarchy very well in arguing about the intermediary powers, which I just explained, that the king, his power always had to go through nobles, and he pinpointed that and stated that France should not become a despotism. And despotism for him was always the East, the Ottoman Empire, or Persia. But there's a famous phrase in his description of monarchy, where he says, no monarch, no nobility, no nobility, no monarch. Because if there were no nobility, there would be constant revolutions, because there would be nobody to oversee the people and keep them in check. They would constantly be rising up and overthrowing despotism. And so we stated in the Eastern countries, like the Ottoman Empire or Persia, there were constant upheavals and disorder because there was no stable landowning, seigneurial domain holding nobles to maintain stability. And he makes it seem that he talks about all of his references to democracy or republics were always ancient, and he made them sound very austere, that the principle holding them together is thinking about the public good. Nobody does anything for oneself, everything for the public. First thoughts are to the public good, not to oneself. And without that, democracy, republics cannot be held together, right? So he makes it seem almost impossible in the way that people often describe communism today. It would never work because it's outside of human nature. Whereas within monarchies, people can strive through ambition to join the nobility and to show off their greatness by being part of the administrative structure of the monarchy and the intermediary powers. And it seems more inclined with people who want to strive and ambitious people who want to make something of their lives.
He actually says that the best government was the British government, right?
He does. He does. Yeah. Yeah. It forms kind of an anomaly in his work because the first several chapters are devoted to the three types. And then he throws in the English Constitution. It doesn't really fit because it's got the elements of the Republican, right? It's got intermediary powers. It's also still has a king, right? And
Yeah.
I think he argues that it was commerce that held it together.
It's what's interesting to me is that the founders in America cited Montesquieu quite a bit, and they're doing it as they're rebelling against the very government that Montesquieu says is the best government.
That's a good
I
point.
guess one of those ironies of history.
That's right. That's right. Checks and balances, right? It comes from Montesquieu.
All right. Voltaire, whose real name I can't pronounce, so we're just going to go with it, the name he's known by.
Yeah.
Voltaire.
Yeah. Voltaire. I think that what his greatest influence on the people of the time, his writing is so vast. He published plays, essays, short novels, multiple every year. And he was probably the best writer in terms of prose, right? He was when people in drawing rooms had to show their wit, they strove to be like Voltaire. But I think his influence is probably anti-clericalism, the power of the church to take away to suffocate human thought and freedom, right? The clergy, and that's another big difference between America and France in this period. Tocqueville pointed this out in his book Democracy in America, is the United States didn't have an institutionalized church, right? So there was no in France, freedom meant rebellion from the church, whereas in the United States it didn't. One could be religious and deeply religious. There's a great awakening around the time of the American Revolutionary War, whereas in the United States to be against oppression was also to be against the church, because the church upheld the monarchy. It was ever present throughout society, from the village to the towns. There are monasteries all over the place, convents where women could be put for life, right? If to arrange family finances, a woman could be put, a girl could be put in a convent for life, right? So the family wouldn't have to pay a dowry. Priests in villages, the biggest building in most towns was the cathedral, right? And the church celebrated the power of the king, gave by the grace of God, Louis XVI is the ruler of the French, and the regime upheld the privileges of the clergy. So to be against the regime was to be for freedom often meant to be against the church, and it was Voltaire who articulated that best. I guess one of his most famous works would be Candide, and in the first 3 chapters he goes over the Inquisition. In the first 5 or 6 chapters, he goes over the Inquisition. It's the absurdity, the hypocrisy of the Inquisition, the oppression of the church behind it. It goes over in the case of Portugal and Spain, but it could be applied to Catholicism. But he also was an opponent of the kind of I guess the herd-like irrational thinking of the Protestant Calvinist religions. And there's the second chapter or third chapter is in the Netherlands, and there's a preacher who's lecturing about charity, and then Candide, the main character, is in bad shape, asks for charity, and is asked if he believes, Candide, the main character, that the Pope is the Antichrist, right? Because it's a Calvinist pastor who's giving this sermon, and he said, "I don't know, I just need bread." And the guy, "You don't deserve it. You don't deserve it." And his wife poured the contents of because people didn't have running water then, their toilet on top of him, right? So he just thought that religion forced people to think in that way, and drew them away from thinking for themselves rationally, and that's present in all of his works. And I think that's probably his biggest influence, because the French Revolution, it expropriated the church. There was a period in the middle of the revolution where churches were closed across France turned into temples of reason, right? And a lot of that came out of he promoted that sort of thinking in his work.
Okay, then
Freedom to think for oneself and not following the dictates of people who profess to know what God wants. Because his arguments in a lot of his work said, how could anybody know? No one's ever been there, met him, and come back. If there is a God, he probably wants us to be good people. And that's what we should do. But we don't need a clergy for that, is basically his argument.
all right, the next guy, I call him a philosopher, although Voltaire said he's not a philosopher, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Okay.
So what was he about?
I'll tell you two things, I think. In his he wrote he wrote some bestsellers too. His novel, it's kind of unreadable for us today, is La Nouvelle Louise Julie, a love story, which it's just so sentimental and goes on and on for about 700 pages, but they ate it up at that time because the 18th century was a period of blossoming sentiment and people got into it. And he's another book on education, Emile. But but I think for our purposes, and in schools, that what people read are his two great works, The Discourse on Inequality and The Social Contract, which kind of go together. And The Discourse on Inequality, which is the first one I'll talk about, he argues that we're all Homo sapiens. We all came out of nature equally, and the fact that we're not equal has to be investigated, right? How did it happen? And he argued that it couldn't have happened without private property. And he argues that it was the first person who created private property and got everybody else to accept that this belongs to him and nobody else can touch it. And there are laws that we have to abide to. Respect of the persons of private property was the person who destroyed natural equality and freedom and brought about civil society and introduced oppression into society. And because the social contract, which he calls it, the laws, right, the agreement to respect this unequal division of property where some are wealthy and some have nothing, was a trick, and it's an illegitimate social contract. So his second book, and it leads to constant disorder, this inequality, right? That the laws protect the privileges and the wealth of the minority and exclude the rest. It leads to constant disorder. What we need is this true social contract, which is the title of his most famous book, The Social Contract, right? And in there, I think, though he doesn't really solve that problem of inequality, if one reads it carefully, and scholars have pointed that out, I think the most important point is this basic idea that the people always have the right. It's always legitimate for them to come together and remake themselves, to say that our institutions are completely illegitimate, and we want to remake them and write a new social contract. And they always have that right to assemble and create a new social contract and say, we want start anew, equal as Homo sapiens, as human beings, and create our institutions anew. And he says that he idealizes the ancient republics. He argued that in ancient Rome, they did that under the Roman Republic, that they would actually assemble and remake new laws for the entire society. And he said, and he basically gives the impression that that's what is necessary.
Now, he is thought of as a big proponent of democracy, of majority rule, but he did say that at the beginning, right, that universal consent is necessary. In other words, at the foundation of society, everybody has to agree to be governed by the majority. But after that, whatever the majority says goes, right? Would you consider him to be a proto-socialist? Because he says money is an abomination. He doesn't use that word. I don't remember the word he uses.
Well, he argues that people get a more firm possession of their property through the legitimate social contract, when people come together and agree to respect property, that's a social contract. Because he lived in a society, as I mentioned earlier, where most of the people were peasants and had plots of land. The idea to make them work communally was just unthinkable at the time, and he didn't think it. And even in manufacturing that was carried out at the time was done by autonomous masters in shops, artisans, if you will. And so the idea of a socially run enterprises was unthinkable at the time. So I guess you could call him a proto-socialist in this idea that anytime that people can come together and remake their entire economy and remake their political structure through a new social contract whenever they want to, I think that's a basic socialist idea.
Okay. The last philosoph we're going to cover is, tell me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Denise Diderot or Diderot.
Diderot, yeah.
So what was he saying?
Diderot. He's interesting because uh what he he might have been the greatest of them all. But what he did is he came up with his most famous, his greatest accomplishment was in the second half of the 18th century. He came up with the idea he saw that the 18th century was a century of learning, of the expansion of ideas, of reason, of people thinking for themselves, right? And that there were breakthroughs in all kinds of domains, the sciences, production, philosophy, economy, and he brought together all of the greatest thinkers of his time to put together the encyclopedia, the encyclopédie. Um, and he would contract writers to write from the German states to the east, England, and he would have his editorial team criticize the submissions, send them back for revisions to try to come up with the latest, greatest knowledge on every subject under the sun. And what makes the period the century of the Enlightenment is that this book, right, with the leading let's say the most up-to-date knowledge on every subject from the sciences, the economy, to politics, to religion. It was a bestseller. When the A would get on the market, it was snapped up, right? Unlike today where people gobble down mindless TikTok, right? Right? They were reading submissions by economists like Kinney and the physiocrats, and Diderot wrote many submissions himself, right? And those were bestsellers. That was the media at the time. So that was his greatest accomplishment, putting together the encyclopedia. He also wrote many personal works, but many of them were never published for fear of censors. One of which was The Nun, La Religieuse, about a bourgeois family. So townspeople, well-to-do but not noble, and the family had three daughters, and they only wanted to come up with two dowries, because women were completely excluded from the economy. So if one wanted to marry, one had to pay a dowry to because the women, they didn't support themselves. But they only wanted to come up with two dowries, not a third. So they put the third girl in a convent. And it's her experience of being forced to take the vows, to live in a convent, and what that actually does to the psychology of women when they're confined under the leadership of a mother superior, who often comes from a noble background, forced to please her, the hypocrisy of Catholicism, of creating these institutions and putting them forward as religious and good and moral, whereas they lead to the degradation of humanity, he argued, right? So that was just one of his books, and he published many of these which never were published. He became so famous that he was invited by the enlightened absolute ruler of Russia, Catherine the Great, to St. Petersburg to give commentary on her laws. She was going to give a new constitution, laws to Russia. This is around 1773, I think. And he made the trek, right? There weren't airplanes or railroads back then. He had to get in a horse and carriage and go all the way from Paris to St. Petersburg. But he did, stayed there for a few months, observed, looked around, saw what he saw, looked at her laws, and wrote his commentary on them. And he denounced everything about Russia, the despotism of the czars, autocracy, serfdom that it still existed in Russia, where the majority of the population were confined to the domain of the manor house and had to do forced labor for the nobles. Denounced all of that, but never published it. Apparently, it was sent to her after he died. She outlived him, and she was enraged after she read the first paragraph and burned it or something. It's
He has a quote that always sticks in my head. It's that man will not be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest.
Well, there you go.
And
That
I think that has, given what we know occurred, with the French Revolution,
yeah,
sort of carries a
yeah,
lot of weight.
yeah.
So during the American Revolution, France was the ally of the colonists, and France spent a
Oh yeah,
considerable amount of blood and treasure.
yes.
What effect did that have on French finance, on the French economy, and on the thinking of the French people prior to the advent of the French Revolution?
Yeah. Well, the easy one is for the French. The American colonists had carried out Rousseau's vision. It come in their minds, right? I mean, everything was much more nuanced as slavery existed in America at that time. But from the French perception, the Americans had come together, formed in the social contract, and remade themselves, remade their laws, and set up a republic, a government without kings, without nobles, and it was extremely influential. They seemed like a new, young, rational people. That's definitely true, based on reason. Um, in terms of the fallout financially and politically, the English actually spent more on this war for obvious reasons than France did, but it didn't destroy British finances, even and they lost, right? It's because of the irrationality of French. One, the British economy, for the way it came out of the feudal period, was already on a capitalist trajectory and was much more wealthy and prosperous. There was a much larger tax base per capita, whereas France came out of this of feudalism with peasants in possession of plots of land and villages and the village community, and a noble privileged class that extracted revenue from the peasants. So the economy, I wouldn't call it capitalist, and so it didn't the tax base just wasn't there to support this international composition with much more dynamic Britain. And also, I mentioned the French political structure with privileged nobles and the peasants, the poorest ones, who had to finance the whole edifice of absolutism in the military and the navy, right? It made French finances much less efficient and much less successful than British finances. And so this manifested itself in interest rates. All governments finance themselves by selling bonds now and at that time.
Mm-hmm.
British were paying, I don't know, 3% interest on bonds they sold to the public because they had a parliament which represented the landed classes, right? And they were the guarantee. The people could guarantee that debt, so interest rates fell. France, it was an absolutist regime. It was a king who ruled absolutely, and that was supposed to guarantee the debt. And the king often defaulted. People knew that, and they knew that the nobles were privileged. So France paid much higher interest rates, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. And so that's why the borrowing to pay for the war destroyed French finances and eventually forced Louis XVI to call the representative body, which hadn't met since 1614, the Estates General, to come up with a new constitutional
You
settlement.
preempted my next
Yeah.
question.
Okay.
So at this point, on the eve of the French Revolution, we've got this philosophical sort of I don't know, a burgeoning sense of the different philosophies are coming out. We've got this example now in America of a republic, and we've got a crumbling French economy. It's a perfect storm, basically. And
Yeah.
like you said, there was the summoning of the Estates General. Now, my reading of the French Revolution is that it can basically be broken down into periods. And it's almost, one can argue that there were actually multiple revolutions over the 10 or 11-year period that it was. And the first period is, of course, the summoning of the Estates General. So, what are the Estates General, and what did summoning of them mean?
As I stated, it hadn't met since 1614. It generated a lot of excitement that people were going to get to remake their society and have a say in government. What it was a representative body of the three estates. The three estates we've already talked about. The first estate, the clergy; the second estate, the nobility; the third estate, everybody else, mostly peasants. But the ones who ended up representing it were the educated, well-to-do townspeople, what one can call the bourgeoisie of old regime France. So it was called. It hadn't met since 1614 because since 1614, because the nobles had privileges, they didn't rock the boat, and kings were able to rule absolutely by taxing the peasants. But as we've stated, that failed by the end of the 18th century. By 1789, in competition with much more dynamic Britain. So the States General was called. It hadn't met since 1614, and the question was, how was voting to take place? This is a story which any textbook on the French Revolution will tell you. People discovered that the clergy and the nobility, they each have one vote in the Estates General. Everybody else, the great majority, will have one vote. The first two estates will be able to maintain their privileges, right? And all the excitement that it generated would have led to this anger that nothing would get done because they're the privileged orders, right? The nobility and the clergy. So there were, in calling the Estates General, the king also, because the king didn't have finances, his power was failing, had to allow free debate, and there was an explosion of pamphlet literature, right? That was the way people could communicate at the time, right? Unlike, right, as we mentioned before, our world with not only newspapers, but now internet communication. People published pamphlets back then. And there was an explosion of pamphlets. So the Controller General, who was Jacques Necker, he agreed to double the representation of the third estate, meaning that the third estate would have 600 deputies, whereas the nobility would have 300 and the clergy 300, rather than each one have an equal representation. But it still left open the question of voting. Would voting be by head then, in which the third estate would equal the first two estates combined, or would it be by estate? And the monarchy didn't decide on this question. It didn't want to rule against the third estate and spark massive protests, but it didn't want to alienate its basis of support, which was the clergy and the nobility. So it didn't do anything. And the deputies met in May 1789 without this issue having been solved. The hope was that they would be reasonable, the deputies, in an age of enlightenment, and negotiate a settlement. The position the leaders of the third estate had, and as I mentioned, the leaders of the third estate, even though the third estate represented mostly peasants who made up over 80% of the population, as I've stated, the ones who won election then, like now, are the educated and wealthy ones, right? The people who know how to speak, who have the resources to campaign, to put themselves forward. And so there were lower level officers, judges in local courts, well-to-do merchants, all substantial landowners, the leaders of the third estate. When they got together in May 1789 in Versailles, they decided that they wouldn't constitute themselves as one of the three estates. And they invited the representatives of the first two estates to meet with them and constitute themselves as one body, to verify their credentials together, right? They didn't come with electronic vote tallies to Washington like politicians do. They actually had to have the signatures from their electoral assemblies in some provincial towns. So they said, we'll verify our credentials with all the 600 other deputies of the first and second estate, rather than as the third estate, because they didn't want to set the precedent of being only an estate and not the nation as a whole. The leaders of the first and second estates demurred. They wouldn't do it. They constituted themselves as estates, the clergy and the nobility, and said, we're ready for business. The third estate said no. And things just went on like this for a month and a half or so as excitement grew, because Versailles and Paris are about 10 miles away, and people in Paris were excited. They would get reports from Versailles every day. They were meeting in this place called this square called Le Palais Royal, where speeches were given. Crowds would form to hear what was going on in Versailles. There's constant go-between between the two, until finally, after some back and forth between the king, the first two estates, and the third estate took the decision to constitute itself, form itself as a body, but called the National Assembly, not the Third Estate. And they invited the leaders of the nobility and clergy, the deputies of nobility and clergy, to join them in the National Assembly. The king tried to thwart this ambition, but ultimately had to concede, telling the nobles and the clergy to go along with this plan and join the National Assembly. But at the same time, troops started to be mobilized. Louis XVI and his advisors started to do what they could to maintain power, maintain authority, maintain order. They also, the king and his cabinet, also his advisors, also dismissed the man who was known as the liberal deputy, Jacques Necker, the one who had called the States General in the first place with Louis XVI, and put in place a more conservative noble minister. And that was a signal for people in Paris to take matters into their own hands. They started to invade, crowds started to invade military arsenals in Paris, gun shops, arm themselves. And they thought that they were defending themselves, that the troops were going to crush Paris
Sure.
to maintain the king's power. And they were just defending their very lives. But all of a sudden, they had taken over the whole city. And the king's forces of order had withdrawn, except for the biggest building in the capital, in Paris, the biggest city, let's say, the capital was Versailles, which was the Bastille, which was both a prison where the king could confine at will opponents, and it was a military garrison, an outpost. And it was the biggest building in the city. And the crowds demanded its surrender. The commander wouldn't surrender, and he actually had the troops fire on the crowds. And this led to a day-long battle on the 14th of July, 1789, in which ultimately the Bastille did surrender, but after killing more than 100 people, shooting them. And so the people were angry. They thought that they had just thwarted a plot to kill them. And so they took vengeance on the people inside the Bastille, paraded their heads around on pikes around the city to show the people their victory over what they regard as the nefarious forces of evil that they had overcome. And the king had to concede that withdrew all troops, that the National Assembly would write a constitution, and that he would become a constitutional monarch. And then he visited Paris and took up the colors of the revolution, the tricolor, symbol of French liberty.
First, I love when you say these names in French because I've only ever read them. So I'm just reading Necker and the Palais de Royal. When you throw in the Palais de Royal, that's wonderful. Yeah. But it also the sort of the conflict with in the Estates General reminds me of the debates in America that led to the Senate and the House of Representatives, where the House of Representatives is a majority-run body that to me is reminiscent of the Third Estate, where they want to run things by majority, whereas the Senate, everybody gets one vote. And if everybody just gets one vote, you're destroying the whole idea of majority rule. But at some point, they had a sort of a meeting down at the tennis court. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, when they declared themselves the National Assembly, they all took all the deputies of the Third Estate, and by this time, I think several members of the clergy and the nobility had joined them. A minority of the representative clergy and nobility had joined them. They all took an oath, a pledge, a promise that they would not disband the National Assembly until they had given France a constitution. That was the tennis court oath. And it's called the tennis court oath because Versailles was not only the center of government, the capital, but it was also where the king lived, and he was the most wealthy person in the country. It had a tennis court. So that's where they met. And there's a famous painting of it by the French revolutionary artist, David. There's a rendering of it if anybody wants to look at that. Tennis court oath. Yeah, the fears of what probably allowed America to make a Senate, whereas France eventually initially only had a unicameral legislature arising out of the the National Assembly, was because fears in France about this class of nobles, that they would maintain their privileges and their power, whereas the United States didn't really have that history. Right? And also, there was also a tremendous effort to maintain order. There was a much greater emphasis on among middle classes in the United States to maintain order because of the existence of slavery, right? And the fear that of what would happen if the slaves were to become free. And so there was much more of an emphasis in the American case on maintaining order, the august body of the Senate to maintain a stable system. Whereas in France, there were less fears because the lower classes were on paper just like everybody else, right? Not slaves, right? They were seeking to become free. They sought to become free, right? And there wasn't that slavery question militating towards having a more conservative outcome.
Okay, so you said they got a constitution.
Yes.
They also got a Bill of Rights, correct?
Yes.
That was partly written by Thomas Jefferson?
I haven't heard that.
Oh,
I
wow.
wouldn't say that. I wouldn't say that he partly read that and wrote it. No,
I
think it
thought
was.
he helped Lafayette write it.
I wouldn't say that it was even Lafayette who wrote it.
Okay,
I think
I've been given bad information, maybe.
Yeah, I think that the consensus among scholars is that it was the collective wisdom of the National Assembly once that after the fall of the Bastille, the nobility and the clergy joined the Third Estate, and many of them underwent a transformation and took up genuine patriotic sentiment. And before they wrote the Constitution, the collective wisdom of that body of 1,200 was to first give a statement of principles on which French political life henceforward would be based. Right, and I think it's fair to say that it was. So there were certain deputies more influential than others, especially the abbot, a member of the clergy, actually, who sat with the third, who was one election within the Third Estate, not the First Estate, the Abbé Sieyès. So he was one. Lafayette, you mentioned, he was another very influential deputy. And it's true that there were certain deputies who were more influential than others, but it was a document written by the leading lights of France, members of the National Assembly at that time, not any individual.
Okay, just so I don't come off as some boob who doesn't know what he's talking about, I did just Google this. Yes. I Googled who wrote the French Bill of Rights, and this is what it says. Yes. Penned by the Marquis de Lafayette with the help of Thomas Jefferson, this draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was written and presented to the French National Assembly on July 11th, 1789.
That's wrong. That's false.
Okay, I could go for it being false, but I have read this before.
Each point in the Declaration, I think there's 18 of them, went before the Assembly for debate, and it was people get up and speak. So I don't like this phrasing. I don't like that phrasing, and they had to come to a consensus over the phrasing. There was no one author who then submitted. Everybody's like, "Oh, we'll sign off on that." That's false.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that gave rise, though, to the Republican period, right? Am I at least right about that?
No.
Okay. When do we have the?
It did give rise to it eventually. The Republic wasn't declared until 1782. In 1789, France became the National Assembly wrote a constitutional monarchy.
Okay. Yes, you're right.
Executive.
Okay. I forgot about that.
Louis XVI was to be the executive. Yeah.
So they have a constitutional monarchy for a while, and then they go into the Republican period. How long does the Republican period last? What did it consist of? And how was life in France in the Republican period?
That's a very complicated question.
Pre-Reign of Terror. I'm going to separate the Reign of Terror into its own thing.
Okay. So the Republic came about in 1792, and it lasted until 1799. So it was 7 years of a republic. It came about because France went to war with Austria and Prussia in 1792. The absolutist regimes in Vienna and in Berlin, and the initial stages didn't go well. And for patriots who believed in the revolution and wanted to defend it, the idea was that they needed a different executive because Louis XVI didn't have his heart in this war. If loss would restore his absolute power. That's what Austria and Prussia would do. They would make sure that the king, they would do away with the precedent of a people's government and restore the absolute power of Louis XVI. So people believe that he didn't have his heart in the war, and he was the executive. The executive is in charge of leading the troops, of overseeing war operations. So there was a revolution within the revolution in August 1792, in which the lower classes of Paris,
You mean
militias,
1792, right?
1792,
Okay.
yeah, militias from across the country, the lower classes of Paris, influential politicians led a military uprising against the king's palace in Paris, and forced him to flee to the representative body to protect him. And France was declared a republic, and new elections were held for a republic. And those elections put in place what a government called the convention. It was called the convention because it was supposed to be a constitutional convention to write a new constitution for a republic, right? A government without a king in 1792, because the belief was that only a republic bringing together the energies of all the people could defend the revolution and the country from these monarchs who were inside French territory advancing towards Paris. And it worked. By the end of 1792, the French armies had repelled the Austrians and Prussians and gone on the offensive into Belgium and the Netherlands. And their first order of business was to decide what to do with Louis XVI. And in a previous incident in 1791, he had sought to flee the country with his family, not accepting his position as constitutional monarch. And he had actually left a note behind, basically rejecting the Constitution and what it stood for of the National Assembly. So he went on trial with these documents presented against him. And there are some famous speeches given by Robespierre and Saint-Just at the trial of the king. These are two members of the convention, very influential members of the convention, and Louis XVI at the beginning of 1793 or the end of 1792, right at the turn of those 2 years, was put to death in Paris. So in Robespierre's words, so that the republic could live, right? Republics don't expect an enemy within their midst, especially in a time of revolution and war. And so the republic then lasted until 1799. The convention became the supreme power, this body elected to give a new constitution.
Okay, I want to back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
Because as you said, the Republican period lasts, I think you said 7 years. But during that, we have what's called the Reign of Terror.
Yes.
So they got what they wanted, right? They got the Republic, the king's out of power, the people are supreme.
Mm-hmm.
What went wrong that led to the Reign of Terror, and what was the Reign of Terror?
All right, so here's how I see it, and there's endless debate on what it means. Some scholars since the 1980s have argued that the terror was latent in the revolution from the beginning, right? And kind of the scenes of the heads on pikes that happened, right, as I mentioned, in July 14, 1789. Others argue that there were circumstances which led to it, and I think that's probably the majority opinion, and it's what I subscribe to. And the circumstances, the terror basically lasted from 1793 and for about a year, 1793 into 1794. After the king Louis XVI was executed, sorry about this. Should have turned my ringer off here. After Louis XVI was executed, the other monarchies of Europe, England, Spain, Russia, German states, Italian states, joined the war against France. So France then was isolated against all of the powers of Europe. And the tide was turned back against the French and monarchical troops, royal troops from other countries actually entered inside of France. And within France, the French military still consisted, its officer corps, many of its members of its officer corps were still nobles from the old regime, because they were the ones who had the military training, who had access to the military training to become generals under the old regime. And one general tried to surrender his troops to the Austrians and help them march on Paris. I think his name was Dumouriez. Another one surrendered the French military port of Toulon on the Mediterranean to the British. And there were fears that if drastic measures weren't taken, that the revolution would fail. So when and most important of the drastic measures was the mobilization of the country, conscription, and this is what made the French military so effective during the revolutionary period, is because it became the first nation of citizens, where people had rights of citizenship, the rights of participation in the Constitution. The government also had the right to force them, to call on them in a draft to fight. So France was able to mobilize the biggest army. But there were a lot of people who were against this mobilization. Right? There were conservative people who thought this revolution killed my king. It's against my clergy. I don't want to fight for it. And so there were rebellions inside of France. So monarchical forces and royal forces on occupying French territory, rebellions against the revolution within France. All right. And also there was another problem, is that with this large military consisting of hundreds of thousands, as I mentioned, France had the subsistence economy of peasants. Feeding them all was very difficult. So the government had to impose price controls, right? And there were fears that of hoarding, of people who held on to grain, seeking to sell it on the black market at higher prices, and wouldn't submit to the government's mandated prices to be able to feed the troops and keep the townspeople alive with affordable bread. So there were fears that people were being starved, the rebellions against the country, foreign monarchs, and so the government took forceful action. It put in place loyal supporters. The convention did across the country, and it started to appease the people who saw noble traitors in their midst. It started to, as I think Robespierre might have said, we have to be terrible so that the people won't be. It started to give people very opponents of the revolution, or perceived opponents, very rapid trials, and then public executions to show the people that it was taking action against all of these enemies. And I think the number is, the consensus number is that in these public executions across the country, about 16,000, 17,000 people were killed. So the terror lasted 1793 into 1794 for about a year, but those numbers are nothing like, say, Stalin's Gulag or Nazi Germany, right? They're completely of a different magnitude, totally different, right? So that's what the terror was. Now, there was even more violence. As I mentioned, there were a lot of peasants who didn't want to abide by, accept conscription, the draft. They were concentrated in the west of France, in a region called the Vendée, a state called the Vendée in the west, near the Atlantic. And there, a guerrilla war developed against the Republic, and in putting down the insurgency there, a lot more people were killed, maybe 100,000.
How do you pronounce that?
Vendée.
Yeah, I always pronounced it the Vendy.
Oh yeah, VND E with an accent, another E. Yeah, the Vendée. Yeah, and there maybe 100,000 people were killed in the fighting, but the actual executions with the guillotine, maybe 16,000, 17,000.
Now, the historian Will Durant argued that the Reign of Terror, that was when the revolution was basically controlled by Robespierre and the journalist Marat, or Marat. I don't know how to say Marat. I don't know how to pronounce it, but. And he says that they were followers of Rousseau, and he basically attributes the terror to the influence of Rousseau. Is there any truth to that?
No, no. He was definitely influenced by Rousseau. There's no doubt. Both Robespierre and Marat. That's true. But that doesn't make Rousseau responsible, right? That's how they interpreted Rousseau's ideas. So the convention, they had to give itself an executive, and the people who seemed most qualified were 12 members. There's a great book on this if anybody wants to read, The 12 Who Ruled by Palmer. And Robespierre and Saint-Just were 2 of the 12. Other names that come to mind were Collot d'Herbois was another member. The names don't come to me right away. Couthon was another. He was actually he had a disability. He couldn't walk. He couldn't use his legs. But a great success story. Despite his disability, he arrived to that pinnacle of power right there with Robespierre and Saint-Just. And he was sent out, Couthon, as a deputy on mission to help mobilize the draft, to make sure that the people kept the Republican spirit, respected the government, made sure that grain and food was available in the towns and for the military. And he went out on mission to the center of France, the region of Auvergne, to oversee this as the person with a disability. He couldn't walk. They had a wheelchair, 18th century wheelchair for him, right? And he was a good friend of, worked closely with Robespierre and Saint-Just too. But these 12 who formed the Committee of Public Safety, they were reelected every month by the convention. So anything they did, members of the convention were responsible for as well. And many members of the convention also committed acts that one would consider part of the terror. For example, one of the most notorious ones was in the city of Nantes, and maybe in the United States would be Nantes or something, Nantes, in Western France, right? Near the Vendée region. And there, to make sure that the priests, the clergy, weren't organizing opposition to the revolution, one of these members of the convention, not the Committee of Public Safety, who had gone out there on mission, he organized what were known as the noyades, the drownings, where these clergymen were put on barges, sent out into the Loire River, because the Loire, the mouth of the Loire is towards Nantes and towards the Atlantic through Nantes, sent them out into the Loire to sink with clergymen who were tied up on them, right? So one of the more notorious acts of the terror. And this was a member of the convention, not of the Committee of Public Safety, not Robespierre and Saint-Just. And Robespierre, then, he fell in an event known as Thermidor. There's a great book on it, just written by a historian named Colin Jones, about those 48 hours right before Thermidor, the day when Robespierre and Saint-Just and Couthon fell from power. But some of the members of the convention, they feared that Robespierre and Saint-Just were going to hold them accountable for their crimes during the terror, right? Some members of the convention, because the convention was complicit in all of these things that had been done. It was easy for the convention to simply blame it on Robespierre and Saint-Just and Couthon, and to thereby wash their hands of it, say that Robespierre had made himself into a dictator. Whereas some of the latest biographies on Robespierre right now, and I'll mention another historian, his name is Peter McPhee. He came out with a biography on Robespierre recently, a very good biography. He basically puts forward Robespierre as a hero. He had mobilized the country in its time of greatest need, during internal rebellion, skyrocketing food prices, fears of starvation, foreign armies on French territory, and he held the country together, mobilized it to fend off all of these crises and to see the successful implementation of a republic. Right. So I think it's false to say that he was a dictator and solely responsible with Saint-Just for the terror.
Well, as he was, eminent over there, quite a few people did lose their heads. I mean, it's not, he wasn't just this peace-loving Republican, country lawyer, right?
Yeah.
Now what role, I want to ask you, did faction play? Because I know there was the Gironde, there were the Jacobins, there were the sans culottes, some French word that means without shoes or without shorts, maybe. I don't remember exactly what the word means. I think it means without shoes. But what role did these various factions play?
So members of the Gironde, they were also elected to the convention. after the fall of Louis XVI in August 1792. But when it came to debates of how to wage this war against all of Europe, they were opposed to the drastic actions of arming common people across the country in a draft, of infringing upon property rights by forcing proprietors to sell food and bread at prices mandated by the Republic so that they could maintain the army. And they saw this movement of sans-culottes in Paris, of just common people, which consisted of master artisans, their journeyman staff, apprentices, building trades workers, merchants, just the lower classes in general in Paris, who were becoming more, who were patriotic, wanted to participate in government, armed themselves to play a role in the government. And the Girondins kept, there were certain speakers, let's say, within the convention who kept denouncing them. And they also opposed these other measures, which I mentioned. And so there was a day at the end of May, beginning of June, over the course of 2 days in 1793, when sans-culottes and militiamen surrounded the convention and forced it to purge the Girondins, who then fled the convention and called for rebellion throughout the country against what they called the illegitimate convention. The convention consisted of 600 members, and so it purged, let's say, 20, 25, called the Girondins. They were called Girondins because there was a province, a state in southwestern France called the Gironde, the main city of which was Bordeaux. And so that's how they got their name. Several of the more influential speakers were from that area. And so that was another crisis that the Republic had to face. These towns throughout the country that had stated that the Republic, the convention, was illegitimate because of this purge of the Girondins, right? And on top of the rebellion in the Vendée of the peasants there, foreign troops on French and foreign troops on French soil, right? That the convention had to deal with. Yeah, so that's how I would best describe the Gironde and the sans-culottes.
Okay, and at what point does the Directory take over, or
Yeah,
do
so
they institute the Directory?
Yeah, so when Robespierre fell, and many terrorists then had whitewashed themselves of their role in it, they set up what was known as the Thermidorian Convention. And I should say it's called Thermidor because when the king fell, the revolutionaries, they felt that they were embarking on a new world, and they wanted to change the old calendar with names from the past, January, February, and give new names, Prairial, Thermidor, Brumaire, and so on, Germinal, so on and so forth. And so Thermidor was the month in which Robespierre and Saint-Just fell. So the Thermidorian Convention then held power for another year and a half, which were the leaders of the convention that had overthrown Robespierre. Now, after Robespierre and Saint-Just fell, and Couthon, those members of the Committee of Public Safety in the late summer, autumn of 1794, there were further denunciations of those who had played a role in the terror, right? More and more purges. But the convention stayed in place for another year and a half, and that was known as the Thermidorian Convention. But by the end of 1795, they devised a constitution, which was what the convention had originally been elected to do, and they put in place a constitution much more, I guess, like the American. Voting rights were restricted by hierarchy of voters. They would vote for assemblies who would then vote for other assemblies, weeding out like the masses in the voting process. 2 chambers were set up, right? But even so, only a third of deputies could be reelected every year. And the executive was the directors, and they all were members of the original convention, which had overthrown Robespierre and Saint-Just. So they were able to maintain control through this only a third being re-elected every voting cycle, and the directors were the executive from the original convention. And then when elections didn't go their way during the Directory, because after all this disorder, sentiment within the country, especially the voting population, had turned back towards monarchy, the desire to have the order and stability of a constitutional monarchy. But the Thermidorian members of the Thermidorian Convention who controlled the Directory, they were regicides. They'd killed the king. They couldn't bring back the Bourbons, right? So they would annul votes. They had control of the army. They would annul the votes when royalists would get elected. But to try to counterbalance the royalists, they would promote Republicans of the ilk of Robespierre and sans-culottes. And then when there were elections that favored them, they would purge those elected deputies. And so there was a lot of corruption in the Directory between 1795 and 1799.
All right, to round this off now, to put a period on it. At some point, Napoleon comes into power, right?
Yeah.
How and when, or when and how? I don't know what order.
So yeah, 1799 in the month of Brumaire. He was a very successful general in the military because so the war continued during this whole period from 1792 all the way until Napoleon fell in 1814, 1815. But he was very successful as a Republican general during the period of the Directory, especially in Italy. He won these major campaigns in Italy, integrated new territories into the Republic. So he became famous, rightfully so. He was a great general, great tactician. Even when his forces were outnumbered, he could sense he had new tactics and mobility with his troops. He could figure out the enemy's weakness and exploit it. But yeah, so he became very famous. As I mentioned, the Directory was clearly a corrupt regime, and the fortunes of war started to go badly at the end of 1799. I think the Directory could probably have handled it, and I think it even started to handle a new coalition fighting against France. But he exploited that. Feeling of crisis that aura of crisis in 1799 to organize from within the military and his close supporters within the Directory, because some deputies conspired with him to carry out a coup d'etat and abolish the constitution of the Directory and institute it with another one dominated, which he could dominate, which was the consulate.
Okay, last question for you. What is, if any, has been the lasting impact of the French Revolution on Western civilization?
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind first is I guess how I characterize the work of Rousseau, that people, the idea of revolution itself, that people can come together and renew themselves, overthrow their governments, rid themselves of corruption and start anew, right? And try to make things right, starting again, saying that this is all wrong and we need to overthrow it. And that has been inspiring to people throughout history, I think.
And the French Revolutionary Government was the first ever to actually abolish slavery, right?
It did. It did, because France had one of the most lucrative slave colonies at that time, in its colony in the Atlantic, in the area of Cuba and Jamaica, the island of Hispaniola. At that time, the French called it Saint-Domingue, their colony. Today, it's the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, but only the portion of Haiti, which the French called Saint-Domingue at that time, belonged to France. And it was the most productive sugar cane slave colony in the world at that point, right? But word spread there to Saint-Domingue of this revolution in France and of people gaining rights and deciding on their government. It was first the mixed population of Creoles, part French, part slave, that started to demand rights. But then the the slave owning authority couldn't control things, and it turned into the first slave rebellion. Now, by the time of the Republic, after the overthrow of the king in 1792, 1793, the period of the convention of Robespierre and the Terror, they had lost control over Saint-Domingue. The slave rebellion was successful, but they were worried that the British would take it over because the British ruled the seas. The French armies did very well on the continent, but the seas were still controlled by Britain. They were worried that the British would take over in an alliance with planters, with slave owners. So they embraced the abolition of slavery, which had been carried out by the slaves themselves, right, freeing themselves. They embraced it, and just as in the summer of 1789, many nobles and clergymen became patriots and played a role in the writing of the first French Constitution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The members of the convention, many of whom had been pro-slavery earlier in their lives, embraced the idea of liberation and the equality of all humanity. And they invited members of the newly independent Haiti, right, that had ruled that not newly independent, say Haiti hadn't become independent at that time, but of the freed slaves to join them as brothers. And several people of African descent, former slaves, met in the convention and were embraced and celebrated there in 1793, 1794. Right, there was a transformation, and so now that didn't last. After the fall of Robespierre, and by 1799, the authorities in France wanted to retake Haiti, Saint-Domingue, and Napoleon sent a military mission there to reconquer and reestablish slavery, which was defeated by the Haitians, by the former slaves under the leadership of
Toussaint, I think, but I don't know how to pronounce it.
Toussaint
I
Louverture.
can't pronounce his name either.
Toussaint Louverture. And they defeated Napoleon's forces sent by ship, and that's when Haiti became an independent country called Haiti.
Okay, you've done a great job today, Professor Miller,
Thank you.
Telling us about the French Revolution. It's been great. Where can people find you? Do you have a blog, a website? I know you mentioned 2 books. You can mention, I mentioned them, but you can.
Oh
mention them
yeah.
Too.
Am I able to screen share?
Sure, I think.
All right.
I don't know much technology. I'm very new to this.
See here.
Nothing's coming up here.
Yeah, I know. I'm gonna do this here.
Oh, okay. I don't know how long it's supposed to take. I don't know anything about this.
Oh yeah. You have a setting which doesn't allow me to share it. But
okay.
People can go to my click around my webpage at UAB, the history department of UAB. Stephen Miller.
University of Alabama, Birmingham.
Yeah, people can just type in Google Stephen Miller history UAB. I'll be the first entry, and you can click around my webpage. I hope people do. I hope people. I think you ask great questions too, and I think this is a great podcast. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you very much for the compliment. All right, for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, leave your comments. Let me know what you think. Till next time.